Welcome to Plato's Cave. I'm Jordan Myers, and I'm a master's student in philosophy at the University of Houston. You're listening to a reading group episode of the show, which means that in this episode, I discuss the paper Semicompatibilism and Its Rivals by John Martin Fischer with three non-philosopher friends, Adam, Giffin, and Brian, because philosophy shouldn't just be for philosophers. And so in this episode, we discuss a wonderful paper from 2012 by John Martin Fischer, who I have interviewed on the podcast. If you haven't listened to that episode, I would actually recommend listening to that one first before this one. This conversation was recorded just after I spoke with John for the first time, interviewing him for the podcast, and so this is kind of a follow-up on that. We discuss Fischer's reasons responsiveness, which breaks down into several components, which we go into and discuss at length. And I think that this paper was a really good introduction to reasons responsive compatibilism. And the second part of the conversation is also a juxtaposition and a comparison between reasons responsiveness and Frankfurt's second order desire account. And I really liked that aspect of the conversation and the paper as well, because obviously Adam and I were very fond of Frankfurt's way of viewing things. So with that introduction, I hope that you find this episode enjoyable as well. I know I loved recording it and I loved re-listening to it. So with that, here is our discussion. Well, let's get into it then. So we're doing another paper in the moral responsibility series. This one is by John Martin Fischer, called Semicompatibilism and Its Rivals. And so by the time this episode airs, I interviewed John Martin, like I told both of you this, but I interviewed John Martin Fischer on the podcast about this paper. But I mean, the scope of that conversation kind of eclipsed the scope of this paper in some ways. But that interview is available, and it will have been in real life. I recorded that about a week and a half ago, but by the time this airs, it should have posted several months ago. So if listeners want to, they can listen to that first or after this, or either. So this was, and I actually asked John Fischer this. I asked him if this, because this is a very cool kind of like recap almost of his view, or like a summary, and he defends it against, some of its more salient rivals. He actually didn't remember if he was invited by the Journal of Ethics to do this or not, but there were some remarks that he gave in the beginning that kind of made it sound like it was. And if so, that's like a very cool idea. Like I like that from the Journal of Ethics.
I also liked from his conversation with you that, he did specify that he wrote this. His intention was that it would be a standalone paper.
Which I think it walks that border very nicely between being a standalone, but very clearly kind of directing you to, oh, you're interested in this part of my argument. Here's a paper in the footnotes that I wrote, to go into that. And like I was showing you guys his CV. I mean, he's got to be one of the most prolific philosophers I've ever seen. On moral responsibility, but just on many things generally. So he's 30,000 foot view is a way to introduce the paper and his views. Well, first of all, I should say this is going to be this is going to be very much an exploration in this paper, because this is the first in the series of a compatibilist style that is a reasons responsive type. And I understand, both from speaking with John Martin Fischer and from listening to some interviews with other philosophers, there are multiple variants, of course, of reasons responsiveness and different kind of varieties of that. So he's going to come out of the wash as what he calls a semi-compatibilist. So he's going to say that moral responsibility is compatible with a certain type of freedom, or it survives kind of a certain type of intrusion from determinism. And he also is kind of clear that he is not exactly interested in whether free will, at least in this paper with respect to this view, whether free will is compatible with determinism, but rather moral responsibility is compatible with free will or determinism. So that's kind of the very, very general framework of this paper. And he says So yeah, I guess we'll just kind of move through the paper systematically, or at least in kind of somewhat a straightforward order. Um, I mean, he says, I talked about this with him in the interview, but I mean, he takes it as a like a sort of uh, benefit or strong point of his view that it has this sort of, he calls it resiliency. Like he says that the famous line that our status as genuine agents should not hang on a thread. So it shouldn't depend on if determinism is true with a probability of 0.99 or 1.0. Um, and so I think that he's kind of discussing all of this as, you know, being an agent in light of what we would need to be morally responsible, not being an agent in light of what we would need to have libertarian free will or be sort of contra causal or create ourselves. Uh, and to be honest, like that's something that my views have actually shifted on during like the course of this series. Is I actually do think that that is way more the important kind of area of this discussion. You know what I mean? Like what do we actually need for moral responsibility, not necessarily to have free will. Um,
Yeah, and also like kind of piggybacking on that a little bit. I think my views have changed significantly in a similar way where like discussing, whether we have any sort of ultimate moral responsibility or any sort of real sense of free will, that's interesting. But at the same time, once you've already kind of gotten past that question,
mm,
and have decided, maybe there's no ultimate sense of moral responsibility, is there any semblance of moral responsibility
mm.
that we can kind of like grasp onto or conceptualize?
We
And
can preserve, yeah.
exactly, is there
Yeah.
some sense? And and that's kind of some of the fun aspect of, compatibilism.
On
So
that note, so I remember Adam, you and I were talking about this before I actually interviewed Fischer about this, and because he has some remarks in the first section of his paper, page 119, I believe, are some of the remarks, um, maybe even into 120. He has what sounds like really kind of ambitious claims in his paper. So he says, you know, he says, quote, I chart out different ways of articulating our inchoate concept of moral responsibility, but I do not argue that one rather than others is the correct specification. I am not even sure that there is one unique specification. In any case, I contend that my account of the conditions in which moral responsibility obtains is compatible with any of the plausible attempts to specify the concept. So at first I was like, what? When I first read that, I
yeah,
was like, wow, that's like a very, very accepting of any interpretation kind of claim, right? Like, wow, you're kind of tying yourself to a lot of wagons there. That was my initial reading of it. But um in the talk, he actually elaborated on that in a way that I thought was super, super interesting. So what he is saying by that, because he says this view that he lays out, a reasons responsive compatibilist, is a view that is possible to apply to any definition of moral responsibility you want to apply it to.
yes,
So if we're talking about reactive attitudes, you can apply it to that. If we're talking about desert practices, retribution, you can apply it to that. If we're talking about even consequentialist considerations for punishment, you can apply it to that. So at first, because at first, like my initial reaction was to really disagree with that. Like, wow, I think there's like super important differences. And he agrees with that. What he means by this is that this framing can be applied to different concepts of responsibility, which is a very
I
cool point.
I totally agree, and it's almost like the concept, the word concept is almost like asking in a broad sense, what is responsibility? Like, what even is this? Rather than conception, which is where it obtains.
Exactly.
So
And
like and that
yeah,
and like
yeah.
and so that's kind of like where he tries to target, and where most people we've read have put their energies. I mean, Strawson,
Hmm.
notwithstanding and stuff like that, but the conception is more of like, where does it obtain? Where is this framework? When do we describe someone as morally responsible? When do we exclude someone? So that's
Mm.
conception in that sense. So
Which which for me and the projects that I'm most interested in, that distinction is invaluable to me.
Yeah,
It's invaluable because
yeah,
it allows you to have so much power but so much specificity at the same time. So you can use, and I didn't kind of get this distinction when we were talking about Frankfurt's second order desires, or what is also called in the literature a mesh case of moral responsibility, because that is the very much in the same way, not about the concept of moral responsibility, but about a conceptual framework for responsibility.
yes.
And so
So regardless of whether
yes,
of what you think
exactly.
more responsibility is, where does it obtain?
Yes.
So I totally agree. Extremely,
Mm.
extremely interesting. So
Which for my larger project of kind of like, I'm like, obviously I don't have like a set view about this, but with all of these kind of evaluations of character that I've been talking about, these are so cool and so important, because that distinction in the way you can view it allows you to both hone in on specific concepts of moral responsibility and then apply them in different frameworks of the application of that concept,
exactly.
which is,
Yeah,
is
yeah,
so
yeah,
cool,
yeah.
like so cool. That
I
like
know, I know.
that point's worth the paper alone.
I totally conflated those two up
Yeah, of
until
course.
this paper.
It's so easy to
Where
do that.
sure,
It's
sure,
so easy to do that.
like what is it versus when is it applied?
It's so easy to do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
No,
So
it's perfect. It's perfect actually. Um, that was one thing that, even though that's obviously you can get that distinction from the previous episode, I thought it was worth going over again.
mm,
Um, okay, so let's get in. So let's just hop right into the control conditions for moral responsibility, because I think this is very interesting. So this is going to be section 1.2. Oh, and I should say I'll post the PDF for this.
1.2. Okay.
So I'll give two quotes from him. Actually, this is the very beginning of 1.2. He says, I accept the traditional view that moral responsibility involves a freedom or control component and an epistemic component. But whereas I agree that moral responsibility requires control, I distinguish two kinds of control: guidance and regulative control. Skipping a few lines. One kind of control involves access to alternative possibilities, freedom to do otherwise. I call this regulative control. The other kind of control does not require such access. It is a distinctive kind of control that does not involve freedom to choose or do otherwise. I call this guidance control. My claim is that guidance control is the freedom relevant or control component of moral responsibility. Thus, an agent can legitimately be held morally responsible for his behavior, even though he lacks regulative control. Okay, so this is where his semi-compatibilism kind of gets its footing, right? So okay, so let's explain the two types of control with his car example. So I'm not going to quote from this, so correct me if I go astray anywhere. He illustrates these two different types of control, and this is where he kind of takes Frankfurt's PAP paper, which we went over previously, and he really kind of runs with it and incorporates it into his own thesis in a way that is actually quite different from the way Frankfurt incorporates it into his, which is interesting.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay, so just to reiterate, regulative control is the kind of control where you have the freedom to do otherwise. That is that alternative possibilities. Now, guidance control is not that type of freedom. And he hasn't defined it yet, but guidance control, in his view, is the freedom relevant or control component that is germane to responsibility, right? So, okay, so he lays it out with he basically just makes his own version of a Frankfurt case, right? So so imagine you're driving in a car. So let's illustrate the regulative control. So imagine you're driving in a car and all of the kind of conditions of determinism have conspired such that at a certain given intersection, you're going to make a right turn, right? It's just all of the causes in the universe and their concatenations have conspired such that you're going to make that right turn no matter what. You couldn't have done otherwise, right? And it doesn't matter really about the details of your constitution or how the car works or where the road's going or anything, right? All of those things come out in the wash. You're just you have no freedom to do otherwise. So that's one sense. And you do make a right turn. So you had no freedom to do otherwise, right? Now, he distinguishes that from basically his own version of the Jones 4 case, I think, right?
Yeah.
Where now this is to illustrate what he calls guidance control. Now, this is a scenario where you're in a car and you're approaching this intersection, and you can make a right-hand turn or you can make a left-hand turn, and you want to make a right-hand turn. And in fact, you do make a right-hand turn. But unbeknownst to you, the details of the car were such that if you would have tried to make a left-hand turn, the car would have prevented you from doing so. It could have some sort of onboard navigation system or something. And there's like a road closure on the left. You're not aware of this, obviously, but the car's navigation system knows. And so if you had tried to make a left-hand turn, it would have prevented you from doing so. So in both cases, you end up making a right-hand turn. Now, as I understand him, the element of guidance control there, is that your actions are sort of, for lack of a better term, under your guidance, right? That's the way in which you're controlling them. You want to make a right-hand turn, and you do make a right-hand turn. So let me try to find a quotation that illustrates this a little bit more. I think that there was something on the going to active reading. Give me a second. Determinism's relevance. So the way I'm understanding him, maybe actually this is a question. This might actually be an interesting question. The way I'm understanding him is that guidance control. Well, okay. So on page 123, top of the second paragraph, just to kind of let his language speak for a second, he says, so my preliminary conclusion is that if causal determinism rules out moral responsibility, this is not in virtue of its eliminating regulative control, if it does indeed eliminate regulative control. So so I take him as saying, look, regulative control is the sense of could have done otherwise, and determinism does. Let's just assume, determinism is true, and determinism does completely vitiate that sense of could have done otherwise. That's right. But Fischer's going to say then that yes, that's totally true, but there's this sort of other sense of control, that guidance control, whether you wanted to turn right and whether you sort of, he wouldn't use this language, but whether you sort of pragmatically could turn right? He's almost dropping the level of analysis down a little bit.
What are you saying with that exactly? Sorry.
So I'm saying, I take it to mean that, like, yeah, that was probably a poor phrase.
Because for me, it's just like, your intentions guiding your actions.
Mm-hmm.
In one case, in the second case, you intend to turn the car right, and you do,
mm-hmm.
but you couldn't have turned left. But there's no difference ultimately to you that you couldn't have turned left, because in fact you did turn right, and your intentions pretty much aligned with.
They're able to be sort of, they're able to be translated into action.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's a better way of putting it than what I said. Yeah, your intentions are able to be translated into actions in that sense.
Yes.
So well, actually, okay, so maybe this is, so I think that guidance control could be, so maybe this is kind of part of my hesitation. I think that guidance control could actually be conceptualized in many different ways. And the way he conceptualizes it is as a reasons responsive type of guidance control, right?
Yeah, and I think also he just wants you to recognize the difference in the scenarios. Like, the difference is not the fact that, or it's not just that he couldn't have done otherwise in both examples. Like there's a significant difference in intending to turn left but turning right than intending to turn right and turning right.
Yes.
Like there's a big difference in the sense that, okay, the outcome's the same either way, but intending to turn right, and turning right, okay, well now this, this has become actionable and it aligns with your intentions.
Yes.
Versus not aligning with your intentions, but either way it ends up the same. There's a difference there.
Yes.
So you exhibited guidance control even in the face of no I just blanked. What's it called?
Regulative control. Yes. Yeah, because I mean, yeah. So you're perfectly right. Because in the first sense, or in the first scenario, there is actually no impediments to your guidance control. Like that is, if you wanted to turn left, you actually could, but determinism just ruined that possibility for you. So it's not about that, but it's about you being able to translate your intentions, desires, thoughts, reasons, motivations right into action. So
can we go to the I know this isn't exactly his point. Because he distinguishes his point from John Locke's point, but I just feel like John Locke.
Yeah. What page is this on?
This is 121.
Okay.
So like this will be second paragraph, or I guess third paragraph. So the second car case should elicit the intuition that we do not need regulative control, genuine access to alternative possibilities in order to have the kind of control involved in more responsibility. The second case, car case, is rather like John Locke's famous example of a man who is in a room which, unknown to him, is locked. The man thinks about whether to leave the room, but decides to stay in the room for his own reasons. The fact that the door is locked plays no role in the man's practical reasoning. Locke states that the man remains in the room voluntarily, although he could not have left the room. Similarly, it seems that I exhibit guidance control of the car, although I could not have caused the car to go to the left. So your intention was for the car to turn right. The car couldn't have turned left. It could only have turned right, but you intended the car to turn right. And, action followed intention in this case, although you could not have turned left.
That's a really good quotation to read, actually. And maybe the way to really kind of crispen up the distinction there is to compare. I mean, he doesn't do this in the paper, but he could compare both scenarios to a case in which if you think about a roller coaster, that is a scenario in which you have neither regulative nor guidance control. And I think that might illustrate the big difference between the two. So in all three cases, you have no regulative control because determinism is true. You couldn't have done otherwise. But in the third case of the roller coaster, you have no guidance control either, whereas you do have guidance control in the first two.
Or about this one? Like I just thought of this one. What if like I held a gun to your head and whether I pull the trigger or not, the bullet's gonna fire into your head, right?
Exactly.
But I pull the trigger.
You intended to kill me.
Intending to kill you. There's a difference.
Exactly.
In the sense that like I exhibited guidance control when I pulled the trigger to kill you, even though the bullet was gonna fire either way. I think that one also helps illustrate a little bit.
Very much so. Yes. Very much so.
Giffin, does that distinction make sense? You're smiling over there.
I thought it was a good hyperbolic example.
But did the example make sense?
The importance of intent.
Yes. To an extent.
No, I think it was good. I honestly thought the kind of car example didn't illustrate it to me at first whenever I was reading the paper. So I think that's a good alternative to bring up. Like
it becomes even more stark with the gun example.
It does. I'm just briefly because I made a note here. This is in 121 as well. Kind of like where he kind of clarifies this. He says, I control the car and I have control of the car, but I do not have control over the car's movements. That's kind of like where he was kind of like laying out the difference. And I didn't think that was as crisp as like the gun example.
And I don't want us to get bogged down here a little bit, but I've just been like, I haven't given this serious thought, to be entirely honest, but I've just been thinking about it just kind of slightly in passing when I've reread this section a few times. But I'm just wondering like whether like this distinction collapses.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
was
you
thinking
know what
about
I
that
mean?
too.
You know what I mean?
Yes,
It's just
yes.
like because I haven't given it enough thought, but like is there actually a difference between the two?
I
Um
had that note too because there's this almost kind of intuition that I have, and I don't know where it fits into this schema, where there's this sense of almost whatever happens, just, that is what happens, right? It's there's almost sort of this. So, I don't know what I think about this, but I'm almost wondering if a sense of could have done otherwise does begin to trickle into the guidance control, and I don't know, and I don't know.
yeah,
Maybe let's keep that in mind so let's get reasons responsiveness on the table and
sure,
mechanism
sure.
control.
Sure. I just wanted to raise that a little bit because
Yeah, it's a good, yeah.
the question you just asked, I had to kind of conceptualize it. But yes, exactly. I wonder whether
Hmm.
regulative control does creep into guidance control in this case.
I
Like
don't know. Yeah.
because
Let's.
like because when you get it into like, actions almost like the gun example or the car example, it's like, okay, yeah, we can distinguish between those two pretty easily. But when it's like
Mhm.
okay, when it comes to intention itself, okay, now could you have intended otherwise?
I
You
can see Paraboom raising that some sort of a variant of that, right? He's going
sure,
to say, look, I would imagine Paraboom might respond something like, look, you've basically taken my 4 case argument. We can fill it out to be 1,000 case argument, and then you've drawn the line arbitrarily somewhere. And
sure,
and arbitrarily there is doing a lot of, it's not arbitrary in one sense because it conserves a lot of like super reasonable intuitions, right? And it makes kind of coherent sense of the world. But I wonder if a Paraboom style argument would be you've just chosen to kind of draw a line here. Um,
yeah, yeah. No, I totally agree. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I mean
yeah.
that's kind of some of my thinking on it, but I haven't like fully fleshed that out. So
No, and I think that we'll probably have to do some more reasons responsiveness papers. Just excuse me, just about just getting into the types of reasons responsiveness because I want to see how certain issues like that are addressed in the literature. Um, so okay, so the guidance control for Fischer is going to get spelled out in terms of reasons responsiveness and mechanism ownership. So um, here's a quote. So he's basically at this point he's arguing that guidance control is what matters for moral responsibility, and that this is related more to what kind of type of person you are, we might say, via your reasons responsiveness. So at the bottom of page 124, he says, quote, my account presupposes that the agent can recognize reasons and, in particular, recognize certain reasons as moral reasons. The account distinguishes between reasons recognition, the ability to recognize the reasons that exist, and reasons reactivity, choice in accordance with reasons that are recognized as good and sufficient. And it makes different demands on reasons recognition and reasons reactivity. The sort of reasons responsiveness linked to moral responsibility, on my view, is moderate reasons responsiveness. And so he distinguishes between strong, weak, and moderate reasons responsiveness. And he and I spoke about this in the episode as well. So basically, strong reasons responsiveness is too stringent a requirement, he says, because it posits a one-to-one match between there being a reason to do something and an agent acting for that reason. So, in other words, it actually is very similar to we've never talked about this, but it's very similar to Bernard Williams has this critique of consequentialism, where he says that consequentialism is alienating from your moral personhood because it demands certain things of you, and those things have nothing to do with sort of who you are as a person, but who you are as a person has to be the person to do those moral things, right? So it kind of, we'll do an episode on that critique at some point for sure. But Williams's point there is that sort of the stringentness, the requirements of consequentialism destroy the very personhood of someone who might try to be a consequentialist. And I take it that there's a similar critique going on with strong reasons responsiveness, right? It's sort of saying that if the sufficient reasons exist, then to be a strong reasons responsive agent, you always follow those reasons. And that's just too stringent.
It's like just to emphasize some of those words there. It's like, you know, if the agent, let's see, no, that's the mechanism. If the reasoning processing pretty much were to operate and there were sufficient reason to do otherwise, the agent would recognize sufficient reason to do otherwise and thus choose to do otherwise and do otherwise.
You always must, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like that. That can't be true. Like,
you're a mere output at that point. Yeah.
Yes. So it's like, I mean, you can recognize sufficient reason to do otherwise, but then choose not to do otherwise. You know, we can all think of examples in our lives where, of course, that's been the case. So
yes,
really it doesn't map on experience in that sense. Like,
it would just be me choosing to, you know, bracket the epistemic concerns. Let's say I just know what the most reasonable thing to do is. It's just the picture of a strong reasons responsive person is always just doing the most rational thing to do. So it's like, if this podcast isn't the most rational thing, like I just click end, I just get up, I just immediately do like the thing that's most rational to do. Or it's just, that's not a person anymore at that point. Yeah. And weak reasons responsiveness is conversely too loose. It's not strong enough of a requirement because it posits that just there is, let me use his language exactly. He says, with the same laws as the actual world in which there, oh, sorry, I misread that. As with strong reasons responsiveness, we hold fixed the operation of the actual kind of mechanism, and then we simply require that there exist some possible scenario or possible world in which there is a sufficient reason to do otherwise. The agent recognizes this reason, and the agent does otherwise. So this is too weak because he says it posits too loose a connection. So it's just, you know, in some variation of this scenario with some variation of the agent, you know, they recognize a reason to do it and they act on that reason. So the problem I take it with this brand of reasons responsiveness is that it always applies. Like there's always going to be some
reason.
There's going to
be
some world in which you do that reason, but it's like, So in the so I take it that if you're a strong reasons responsive compatibilist, no one's ever responsible because no one's perfect. And in the weak reasons responsive case, everyone's always morally responsible because there's always some reason in some world in which you do it.
Yeah, it's like, you know, why did you drown your children? You know, well, you know, they were the incarnate devil. You know what I mean? Just like, well,
yeah.
You know, it's like it's some reason in some world.
Exactly.
You know, so
or I mean, like, well, you know, obviously we would want to say that's a bad reason, but you could even say I saw 0.001
could be sufficient to them. But
well, I was even going to say like you could even come up with a reason that's like not obviously wrong, but it's also not a good reason. Like there's a 0.001% chance that they destroy the world, right? It's like sure that there's a chance, you know what I mean? So it's yeah. Okay, so John Martin Fischer then lays out this moderate reasons responsiveness, which again, Adam and we discussed right before the Fischer episode or the interview that I did with him. And so this one is interesting because it posits that if an agent recognizes in a range of possible scenarios what can be seen from an appropriate third-party perspective as an understandable pattern of sufficient reasons for not doing X, and there is at least one such scenario in which that agent refrains from doing that action for that reason or for such a reason. So I confirmed this because I had a little bit of a hard time conceptualizing this, and Adam, you and I talked about this. So basically, what this means is that the person in question recognizes, and he even talks about this as reasons recognition versus reactivity. So this is basically saying that a person who is moderately reasons responsive will recognize that there are legitimate reasons for not doing X and for doing X, and perhaps, for doing variations of X. And this is a person who recognizes reasons to do multiple courses of action, right? Now, let's say that they actually,
and not just that, let me kind of add on to that, but it's also the pattern of it. The pattern is really important here, is where there's some logic to what they recognize as a sufficient reason.
So, and so, yes, you're totally right. And that's the part where he mentions the rational third party perspective. Now, it's not that there has to actually be a third party present at all times, but it's that, we kind of like this kind of like Rawlsian, like, rational agent kind of, hovering above your shoulder in the background, right? What would be a rational reason you recognize as such, even, this is important, even if you don't act in accordance with that reason. That's the difference between reasons recognition and reasons reactivity, I take it, right?
100%. Yeah, you have to just recognize this is a sufficient reason.
Exactly.
It's like, and also just like a pattern of sufficient reason.
Yes.
It's like, okay, like I recognize this is a pattern of sufficient reasons, but you can either act in accordance with them or not in accordance with them.
I want to give the example that Fischer provided in our interview, because I think it's actually really good. He said, because listeners might be thinking like, well, what counts as like a rational reason, right? That those are legitimate questions to ask, but those are more about kind of spelling out the details of it. Like this is like a grounding claim that he's making. So he laid out an example, so let's say that you've been kind of like a frugal person, and there's a sporting event that you want to go to. And let's say that you kind of hold that like $75 is too much. So a reason to not go would be that it costs $75. Well, if you would, but let's say, if it cost $50, you would go. Okay, that's fine. But then if it cost $20 and that would be a reason not to go, that actually doesn't align with anything because the pattern there doesn't fit, right?
Yeah.
Like presumably if you're willing to pay $50 to go, paying $20 to go is not a rational reason not to do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Or just the other direction, just for clarity. If you're a frugal person, you're not willing to pay 75, but you're willing to pay 90.
Exactly. It makes no sense.
It doesn't make any sense unless, as in your conversation with him, you had kind of elicited an interesting response from him in the sense that you're constantly updating how you're viewing somebody's reasons. So perhaps there is a sufficient reason for why 90, falls into a logical, rational pattern, but 75 doesn't. I mean, I don't know why on the spot that would be the case, but
I've got one. You could even, it's implausible, but like just, you could even think that like if the number were low enough, it would mean that there would be some sort of exploitative labor that you wouldn't want to support, something like that, right?
Sure, or the game's not going to be as good.
Yeah, exactly. Actually,
it's not worth going to a $75 game, but once we hit 90, that seems to be
they're putting on a good show at that point.
Yeah. Who knows where that line is exactly? But
sure.
There needs to be some consistency to the pattern of recognition of sufficient reasons.
And importantly, also because I think it's easy to gloss over this point too, in saying that yes, I'm willing to pay $75 to go. That person would also recognize, not necessarily react to the reasons why one ought not go if the ticket costs $75, namely that money could be donated to Oxfam, right? Like that's a reason not to go. Now you don't have to conform with that reason, but you ought to recognize that reason, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then a point you had brought up in that conversation I thought was a good one is that somebody should be able to recognize as a sufficient reasons they've given in the past, or so if someone were to say, if in the past that person had said $75 was too expensive for that ticket, but now they're saying, no, I don't mind paying $75, bringing up that reason that it would be expensive, if they didn't recognize that as a good reason anymore, that would be strange. It'd be strange.
Weird, yeah.
They don't have to act upon it, but not recognizing that as a sufficient reason, like frugality, when they've clearly, recognized that reason before, that doesn't show a pattern of reasoning that is consistent or logical or rational.
And this is extremely germane to real life too, because oftentimes we're explicitly motivated in that, doing something like, this happens all the time. Someone gets a promotion at a job and suddenly, a night of splurging and indulgence out in the town is actually something that they're willing to do. Right.
Sure.
So if that person was moderately reasons responsive, they would recognize in both situations, the pre-promotion in which they do not go out and splurge and the post-promotion in which they do, the range of reasons for doing that or not. But just it's for them, the reasons their circumstances have changed. And so the reasons then change, or which reasons are valid to them or not have changed. But they ought to recognize both in both.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Let me throw out one more just for fun.
Yeah. And then I want to return to the character point. Yeah.
Sure, of course. But it's almost like, if I were just some sort of health guru in a sense, but then like I fell off that wagon and, I started eating poorly. I was like eating like just some large piece of cake. And you're like, don't you value health? If I were to say like I can't even like recognize that as a sufficient reason, like that would be very strange. I might act upon it, I might indulge myself, but if I can't even recognize that as a sufficient reason, that would be deeply strange.
Okay, so, this is exactly what I wanted to return to, because I thought this might have been my favorite part of the conversation. I think, and I don't disagree. And actually, this was super cool because, John Fischer said, this is actually something I'm still kind of working out. So we were just talking about it, which was so cool. It seems to me that because I actually wonder if his view has do you remember we were talking about there's four main types of reason or compatibilism? There's reasons responsiveness, there's moral reasons responsiveness, there's second order desires, and there's character-based account. And initially we thought, character-based account's kind of like obviously kind of too simplistic. It's kind of dumb, right? We actually brushed it aside because it's like, an action's free if it's within your character. It's like, okay, well, yeah, it's a little too simple. I think that there's a very interesting injection of a character-based account in this moderate reasons responsiveness.
I totally agree. I totally see the connection now.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm actually wondering if there needs to be and if I get into UCR, this would be such a cool project to work with him on. I think that there needs to be perhaps an injection of another condition into this moderate reasons responsiveness, or maybe it's just however we want to frame it, it's another condition. But there does have to be this broadly kind of character consistent account to it, because it's exactly what you just said. Like if you were a health guru, and you had valued this, and then suddenly you just don't anymore. You're like, you're like a wanton with respect to, your health at that point.
Yeah.
Then because, it's odd because you still could be kind of reasons responsive, but you've very strangely eschewed one reason in particular that's not consistent with who you've been in the past.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to, validate every reason or every reason is sufficient that someone could provide you, even if we might see it as reasonable, right? But the idea of that discontinuity that you couldn't now please recognize that as a sufficient reason, of a reason that you would have given in the past or valued in the past.
Yeah.
Something odd to that. Yeah.
Okay. I didn't think of this in his conversation, but what you just said made me think of it. There's almost, so we might even distinguish between kind of like a soft and a hard rationality or reasons here, right? So one, like a reason, let's go to let's stay on the health example, right? So I would want to argue that a strong reason that everyone should recognize, not necessarily react about, would be that um, eating well, increases your health, right? Now, people are, but everyone should recognize that reason. Um, but here's kind of a soft objectivity reason. Eating well tastes good, right? Now that is actually true for me, right? You can kind of get like addicted to eating well, right? But it's totally plausible that another person just isn't true of them. So they do eat well, and that's like a value for them for their health, but they just hate it the entire time, right? And that's just differences in constitution, right? Um, so it seems to me like it might even break down further, where to be moderately so moderate reasons responsiveness might require that you adhere to all objective or strong reasons, but then there are these other kind of soft or non-objective reasons that can come and go. And I wonder if, I don't know, I'm just thinking about that with respect to the character-based account.
I definitely get where you're coming from there, where there's like a certain subjectivity where it's not incumbent on you to recognize that as a good reason. Like certain reasons. Other reasons are almost like hard facts that you should, as
like moral facts or empirical facts or just something.
Rational, a rational person should recognize them at the very least. But then there are other where it's more subjective.
Because you could just have differences in value that I think fall into that much more soft reasons.
Yeah.
But it would still be extremely strange, and you may not fit the conditions if you don't adhere to your own historical sense, at least given a certain time frame, right? Like
I was just thinking about that.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, like, we can think to some like maybe perspectives or ideologies we used to hold.
Exactly.
And we had reasons that we recognized as sufficient reasons, but today wouldn't recognize as sufficient reasons.
Yes.
So that discontinuity of that sense, that actually seems like a very rational discontinuity, where even if someone were to present to me sufficient reasons that I used to consider sufficient, I wouldn't consider them sufficient. I wouldn't even recognize them as sufficient reasons given my current state of mind.
Here's an example, maybe. Okay, so let's say you're a conservative person politically, right? And because of that, you want a closed border, right? That's a reason that you kind of, you respond to. Now you learn empirical facts that change your mind about that. Let's say the empirical fact is that of all people admitted as immigrants, the rate of crime or something that they commit is lower than people born in the United States, right? So you were thinking like, I don't want people like causing crime coming in, whatever, right? You learn that that's not true. Now that reason is no longer valid for you, and that discontinuity seems to be one that is acceptable, but it's conserved because of so like the way you view those reasons have changed. It's not that you've dropped a value or something, right?
Yeah, I agree with that. And it almost seems like in the case you gave there, other reasons have, become not more sufficient, but just more rational, and just you give them greater weight.
Yeah,
there's still a pattern that's consistent. Like that seems to be the key. Like you can identify a framework within which you can kind of explain like the changes.
That's a good point, Giffin.
Yeah.
Like the pattern aspect makes sense there, where it's like you're actually still there's like a certain aspect to like the defeasibility aspect there, where your mind did change upon this, using this framework as Giffin just mentioned there. You had a framework in which ideas and reasons were defeasible, and one fact that came in, ultimately made you reject a reason you used to find sufficient.
Yeah, I think if you imagine kind of like that kind of pattern, like, a large superstructure kind of way, you can kind of account for those kind of changes that we were thinking about. It would have to be pretty drastic, like really like almost a vampire problem, like transformative, for it to be just completely unlike recognizable to like your past state. Like think like 15 years ago, whenever you're, back in like middle school or something, right? Like they're just like totally just, I mean, you like what kind of subhuman kind of framework is this that I'm looking at,
Yeah, you're just alienated from who you were at that point.
Yeah,
but it's
like,
not as if you woke up and were just alienated. Like that would be weird. You go to bed a conservative, you wake up a progressive. Like that wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But it's going to be like very difficult in any of these to specify sort of, what's the necessary rate of change or something, right? But I think what matters is that there clearly is a difference in those, and I don't know that defining sort of where along the where along the temporal spectrum the change happens matters necessarily as much.
Yeah,
right?
Some of those would be pretty tough to kind of pinpoint.
Yeah.
Would like the introduction of like the rational third party, clarify any of that, in the sense that like, if a rational third party viewed some sort of character discontinuity, you know what I mean? I don't know.
For like a bad. Okay, so you're even asking about the reasons for the character change or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Like if that were viewed like by a rational observer as
okay.
But as rational itself, even though the third party observer could disagree with the reasoning that got you there, but that it was a rational process at play to get you there, then, like...
Let me venture a guess, or an example then. Okay, here's what we might say is a good, or not good, sorry, a rational change of character. You, in a very... just like traumatic experience or something, right? So you barely escape death, and that alters the way that you view how you're spending your time, and that causes you to radically reevaluate your career or some major, or you get divorced or something. Like, I'm actually not happy with this person, right? Something like that's a huge change in character, but it was due to a sort of zeroing in on what you actually value. That seems to be what that seems to be a rational change of heart. Here's one that doesn't. You taste like this newfangled dessert for the first time or something, and it just like encapsulates your mind. You're just engrossed with this new dessert. You shape your life around getting more of this dessert. You know what I mean? It's just like, that seems to be a bad reason to transform your character.
Yeah, and a rational third party would view that as exactly there aren't the mechanism in play here that is arriving, that is evaluating reasons and arriving at the idea of directing one's life around getting more of that dessert. That is an irrational discontinuity from the character before. So based on the reasons used to make that character change, or the reasons that influence that character change.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how I feel about this example.
Okay, repeat the example then. Which example? I mean, what are you talking about?
Like the difference between like using, I guess this would be using like the third party to remedy like whether or not the character change would be what's the rational? I think, yeah, okay. I'm just not sure, because in this example that you gave, like clearly we would kind of scoff at the person who basically changes his life around whatever the dessert is, but it might be, I don't know, I guess I'm trying to like rationalize whether or not, like I can imagine some reasons where it could be, like consistent character wise.
Yeah, but then it wouldn't be a change of character. We were talking about in cases where your character is radically changed.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to think of is it's almost like is it consistent with your character for you to react that way to such a change? Do you know what I'm saying? I'm stepping back a little bit. And I'm trying to think about, is it consistent with your character that like you encounter this like life threatening kind of encounter and then you come away radically changing your life? Does that framework make sense?
I don't know.
Yeah. But if like a third party were to like if a third party were to observe that,
yeah,
I don't think they would, say given your example there, they assess that actually the way that this mechanism has been operating, it seems that there is no true discontinuity between who they were and who they are today based on the reasons involved in this change of behavior, because those reasons at play were still operating before this event. Is that what you're saying there? Because you're saying that it actually wouldn't, imagine a person in which you could actually imagine that, like they construct their life's project around getting this dessert.
Yeah.
But in that sense, the reasons involved wouldn't be a radical discontinuity then. The reasons involved in their change of behavior.
Yeah, the whole point is that, so what we were talking about is like in cases where your character is altered.
Right.
I think the problem with your question is you were almost introducing like some sort of a metacognitive character. It's like the character about which they either sign off or not on changing their character. But I don't really know what that is. That seems like a little bit of like a dualist intuition or something.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I was just
Giffin,
kind of thinking.
Giffin, did my response make any sense there?
Kind of.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
There was some point that I was thinking of before we went off on the digression about, it's lost to me. I don't have mechanism ownership over that part. Shoot, I'll have to just cut that out, I guess. I can't, it's honestly, I fully blanked on it. Shoot. Yeah, I don't know. It seems like there's clearly, there's some way in which character, like a character-based account is factoring into a condition here. And I wonder, I wonder about that. Oh,
I agree. I don't think we solved it, but I agree. It's there. That's definitely part of this here.
There's some character kind of condition that is lurking, and I don't mean lurking pejoratively. I think it's like a very like happy addition to this. I would have to kind of dive into some character-based accounts, literature, and see exactly kind of how to integrate that. But it does seem intuitively congruent with the rest of this. Yeah,
it would be super strange if, like, I mean, there are many people we would call moderately reasons responsive, but perhaps they're people that wouldn't recognize as a sufficient reason just the value of learning. Like if you were like, why read this book? Like, this book on, I don't know, any subject you want. Maybe in this case, how about philosophy, for example? Like in your case, philosophy, and I were to say, one reason to read the book is that, it's just, for your further edification in the field. You'd be like, okay, I
recognize that that's a reason.
I recognize. But then if I were to come to you one day, say tomorrow, and say that exact same spiel, and you don't even recognize that,
it doesn't even register for me.
Then there is a major discontinuity in the sense that, and once again, there are people for whom they don't recognize that as a sufficient reason. They don't recognize it, but we would still call them moderately reasons responsive because they still recognize sufficient reasons to do one thing or the other, but they don't recognize that reason.
Yeah, insofar, so this is, so if we want to say that given reason falls into the soft objectivity bin as opposed to the hard objectivity bin.
I would say so.
Yes, and I just wanted to clarify for listeners, that entire distinction, that digression, is not Fischer's view. That was just our kind of like thinking about it. So I don't want to, kind of cast that onto him if he thinks something different. So I think that we were just at the point where he was about to introduce the aspect of mechanism ownership. Should we introduce that? Because this is very important to his view also. So very bottom of 125 going into 126, he says, on moderate reasons responsive views, agents can be morally responsible for weak-willed and morally wrong actions, but certain clearly insane individuals who do not exhibit the requisite capacity to recognize patterns of reasons are not deemed morally responsible, which I find extremely intuitive and plausible. He says, but one could exhibit the right sort of reasons responsiveness as a result, say, of clandestine, unconsented to electronic stimulation of the brain, or hypnosis, brainwashing, and so forth. So moderate reasons responsiveness of the actual sequence mechanism is necessary, but not sufficient for the control linked to moral responsibility. I contend that there are two elements in guidance control: reasons responsiveness of the right sort, namely moderate kind, and mechanism ownership. That is, the mechanism that issues the behavior must, in an appropriate sense, be the agent's own mechanism, which is, we talked about this in the episode, but this is extremely, interesting as well. And he said that he was, in thinking about this, he thought of a Frankfurt style example wherein you're implanted with a device in your brain that controls all of your actions, and it is moderately reasons responsive, but it's not your mechanism. You don't own the mechanism in any sense, so you wouldn't be reasons responsive. So he realized he needed to add this second condition, that you own the mechanism that is controlling the behavior. So I mean, this seems obviously true to me. I don't even understand how someone could argue against that. If you don't own the mechanism by which your reasons are being cashed out, it does seem, and this is how he, and yeah, I mean, this is how he really kind of zeroes in on the guidance control, right? Because he says that there are these two parts to it. I see that as just like intuitive, obvious, and coherent, right? What would an objection to that even look like, to be honest?
Well,
actually, no one in the literature.
I mean, maybe in the sense that one could argue maybe there's not much of a difference.
That is what. So the one rejection of that I do know of in the literature is by Christine Korsgaard. So remember, we did, this never aired, but we were talking about in her book, Creating the Kingdom of Ends, chapter 6 of that book, called Morality as Freedom. She introduces this thought experiment. It's her own version of a Frankfurt case. And there's this device implanted in your brain that controls all of your actions. So it's not like the kind of narrow driving case or the voting case that Fischer talks about, or the Frankfurt style cases. This device controls all of your actions. And Korsgaard never specifies whether it's reasons responsive or not, but let's even just grant that it is for the sake of this objection. She claims that you would still act under the guise of responsibility because you would experience yourself as agentic, even if you had this device implanted in your brain. Now, it seems to me that if the device was working as intended, her claim is true there. But this demonstrates to me the obvious requirement for mechanism ownership, because if Adam, in your sleep tonight, I implant this device and I'm controlling you and I do something that is outside of your character, something that you would not recognize as a legitimate reason, just like committing an unjustified murder of a homeless person or something, right? Like that's not in your character to do. And currently you wouldn't recognize a valid reason to do it, right? It's not going to be for some greater good. It's not going to be to save someone's life. It's not even going to be to put him out of his misery, right? Like none of these reasons would be there, and you still do it. I think that like the obvious normative information there is whether the device was implanted in your head and determined that action or not, like the mechanism ownership point, right?
Am I reasons responsive in that scenario though?
If the mechanism is reasons responsive, then sure.
No,
it's
but
just like,
but in that scenario where I still recognize?
mm-hmm.
So
yeah, you recognize all the reasons not to do it, but you still do it.
Okay, so weak-willed.
Well, not even weak-willed. It would just be that like the device, the weak-willed implies that you like really, really want to do it, but like you know, you just kind of can't like you can't get yourself not to succumb to it. This is just like you do think it's the right, but my point is that
I'm doing it just because you're having me do it.
Exactly. Yeah. Because that demonstrates to me the obvious importance of the mechanism ownership. If we want to hold you morally responsible.
I don't want to quibble too much on that, but I still think there's like an inconsistency with like your example here, where the idea for like the chip being implanted in my brain is that it needs to be indistinguishable from like
subjectively for you.
For me.
Yeah.
So the idea is either that I can't really imagine a situation where it's subjectively not different, but I don't really want to kill this homeless guy.
You wouldn't, but you would feel as though you do. But I'm saying absent the device, you wouldn't.
No, but then if I really feel like I want to,
mm-hmm.
but I recognize reasons not to, that would make me weak-willed.
No, I don't think so. Not necessarily.
I really want to kill the homeless guy, right? Again.
No. Okay. Why? Maybe I explained it wrong. It's not. I don't think it's a case of weak-willed action, because weak-willed action, weak-willed action implies that you actually want to do other than you did.
Yes. So like, I mean, like,
I was saying you recognize,
but not necessarily though. Given like his earlier framing of reasons responsiveness, it just comes down to the sufficiency of the reasons as well. I mean, like you're referring more to like the Frankfurt's weak-willed case there, where in terms of like first order desires, second order desires, like in a Frankfurt case, it would come down to I didn't want to kill, the homeless person, but I did. But in this case, I'm viewing weak-willed more in the sense of the reasons responsive, as he kind of laid out earlier, where it's I don't have sufficient reasons to kill the homeless person. Like I haven't been presented with sufficient reasons that I recognize. And then there are sufficient reasons that I recognize not to kill the homeless person, yet I still kill the homeless person.
Yeah, so that's not exactly what I was trying to. That would be sort of the case of you're almost kind of like helplessly watching yourself do it, and you're like not in control of your body. I was saying
that's kind of how you described it. Of like,
then I didn't mean to.
Okay, yeah. Then can you lay it out again then?
All I was saying, it honestly, it wasn't like the main point of what I was trying to get at, but all I was saying is that, you're Adam right now, the type of person who wouldn't kill a homeless person. It's because you both don't want to, and you don't see any good reasons to do it. Right. And it's not in your character. Right. If a device were implanted in your brain that changed the way your brain worked such that you did see a good reason to do it, and that subsequently motivated you to want to do it, right? Like there's just no, in Frankfurt's terms, there's a mesh between the and you don't really, because you both falsely see a good reason to do it because of the device and you want to do it, it seems in that moment that it's in your character to do it, right? It's your new character. But
Sure.
I was saying that if we were to remove the device, and you're back to normal after, you'd be horrified by what you did.
Sure.
And that to
Sure.
me demonstrates the crucialness of the mechanism ownership as
Yes.
Fischer. Yes.
I do quibble though with the paragraph after this though of how Fischer and Revisa argue for a subjective approach to mechanism ownership.
Do you want to read that paragraph then?
Yeah. So I have argued for a subjective approach to mechanism ownership. On this approach, a mechanism becomes one's own in virtue of one's having certain beliefs about one's agency and its effects in the world. That is, in virtue of seeing oneself in a certain way. Of course, it's not simply a matter of saying things. One actually has to have the relevant constellation of beliefs. On this view, an individual becomes morally responsible in part, at least by taking responsibility. He makes this mechanism his own by taking responsibility for acting from that kind of mechanism. In a sense, then, one acquires control by taking control. When I act on my own, suitably reason's responsive mechanism, I do it my way.
I get what you mean by that. Yeah. So the reductio to that is if you just, kind of embraced the device, then it would be your own. And I agree with you in your disagreement of that then.
Yeah, exactly. Because the device could implant
a
sense of ownership.
Yes.
Like, so in that sense, like the subjective, what was his exact phrase? Let me go back to that there, where it's a subjective approach to mechanism ownership.
Yeah.
I don't think that cuts it entirely. It can't just be a subjective approach, can it? I mean, given that device implanted in your head.
That's a good point. Yeah, I actually hadn't sort of recognized what was being said in that paragraph.
Yeah, I had an issue with that.
Yeah. I mean, that actually, if in fact that's what he's saying, I don't think that makes a lot of sense, because of that doesn't even seem to conform with what he previously kind of argued. So,
yeah.
Okay. So let's bracket the proviso that obviously we could be misinterpreting this, but if he means that, then I would very much disagree with that.
Yeah, because the thing is, I had to reread that a few times because, he said, okay, it can't be a chip in your brain. You can't be, the Manchurian candidate in this case.
Where if you just embrace that? Yeah, it's like
exactly, and it's like, okay, I buy all that. I totally agree. Then it's like, but I argue for a subjective approach. I'm like, well, then that can still creep in. Mm-hmm. So I have an issue.
Yeah. Okay. If he means that, then I agree with your point. And it seems like the requirements should be very in alignment with what a rational third party would deem, and whether it's been in your character. Yeah. To embrace that mechanism, right? I
agree.
Yeah. So we can make it less science fictiony. Like if you have a brain tumor, a rational third party, anything that is resultant from the brain tumor, a rational third party should say that that's not a good mechanism to own. And you before the brain tumor presumably would have also said that. So if you with the brain tumor because of the brain tumor then own the brain tumor, that doesn't seem like a good reason to me.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
Yes. Okay, I'd like to ask him about that.
Yeah. So
okay, I'm very glad that you made a circle back around to that. I would like to follow up with him about that.
Yeah.
What was I moving forward actually to? I think that we've drilled down on reasons responsiveness a good bit. I guess we can kind of, do you want to do kind of the beginning to close the podcast with talking about the differences between his critiques of Frankfurt? Because I like Frankfurt's view, and it's obviously interesting. Okay, so let's get to the differences between he and Frankfurt, because we've covered Frankfurt's views not extensively, obviously, but we did both of his most famous papers in the series previously. So I take it that where they disagree, it's not going to be where Fischer disagrees with Frankfurt is not going to be found in his 1969 alternate possibilities of moral responsibility. The disagreements are all found, I think, in the 1971 freedom of the will and the concept of a person, where he introduces his second order mesh compatibilism. So, okay, first of all, we're assuming we can't really go over Frankfurt's view. So if people haven't listened to that episode, that's probably something that is required for the rest of this episode. But okay, the Adam, I was very interested to hear, because I know you, as am I, are a fan of Frankfurt, but perhaps you might be a bit of even more of a Frankfurt fanboy than I am. you like Frankfurt.
I don't know as much after reading some of these. Here's the thing about these before we go through them.
Yeah.
But some of them were like a gut punch.
to a Frankfurt boy.
Yeah. Some of them were like of them I hand waved away because I'm like, you didn't get Frankfurt. Like, and we'll get into them a little bit. Some of these, like the first one we're gonna cover, weakness.
It's a gut punch.
It's a gut punch. It's a gut punch, and it's like a gut punch. I think the well, I don't know if I want to give the game away, but I'll just mention the two biggest gut punches here. The weakness of the will.
It's a huge one.
And then what was the other one? It was responsibility for wantonness.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I thought that was one of the weaker critiques. Okay, let's get to that.
And identification and ownership. that one hit hard.
Okay, all right. Let's be promiscuous in how we bounce around here then. So, okay, we're assuming that if you're still listening, you understand Frankfurt's view as we laid out in the previous episode. Okay, so let's go to weakness of the will, because I thought that this was the first one for a reason. Like this just was the uppercut to the gut of the Frankfurt view. Okay. Let me read. I'm going to read the last sentence in the first paragraph and then a majority of the second paragraph, but skipping a few. So he's going to say, okay, first, Frankfurt's approach, but not mine, faces a terrible problem with respect to the lamentably widespread and real phenomenon of weakness of the will. So he says, okay, we're all familiar with Frankfurt's unwilling addict, but now imagine an individual who is not an addict to the drug, defined as involving an irresistible desire. Rather, the individual simply has a first order desire to take the drug, a first order desire he correctly takes to be resistible. We can even suppose that although the desire presents itself with a significant intensity, it is not anywhere close to being experienced by the individual as so intense as to be genuinely irresistible. The individual simply would like to experience the pleasure and fun of the drug. But we can suppose that on balance, he judges that he should not take the drug. Perhaps he has to drive some distance later and believes that it would be safer if he refrained from taking the drug. Nevertheless, we can imagine what is not uncommon, that in a moment of weakness, the individual goes ahead and takes the drug anyway, even though he formed a second order desire not to act on his first order desire to take the drug. Now, he continues in the next paragraph. Further, we can imagine that not only does the individual form a second order desire to act on his first order desire to refrain from taking the drug, he does not form a second order desire to act on his desire to take the drug. But like so many of us in at least some contexts, looking at the dessert menu, considering the second martini, thinking about writing the article promised to the editor, the individual is weak and goes ahead and takes the drug. So this is, I mean, it's wonderful because, so I'll give the punchline. He says, and yet Frankfurt's account implies that the agent, being an unwilling drug user, is not morally responsible for taking the drug. So his entire point here is that, wow, we're supposed to have this intuition that, as per Frankfurt, the unwilling addict isn't morally responsible. But then he actually indicates that, okay, if you buy that, there's actually no difference that Frankfurt can account for between an unwilling addict and just normal widespread pedestrian weakness of the will, because if you can't resist your desire, if you do succumb to it, you succumbed to it, even if you should, even if it was a desire that we and the agent would think should be resistible, right? So the problem that he levies against Frankfurt is that there's not really a strong distinction between an unwilling addict and anyone who doesn't conform to their second order desires. You know what I mean? But people who have just normal akrasia, or just the Greek word for weakness of the will, those are people that we do and want to hold morally responsible. Like, you're actually just weak there. But on Frankfurt's account, it's not possible to do that because of the misalignment between the first and second order desires. I laid that out correctly, Adam, right?
Yes.
What does the Frankfurt fanboy have to say?
Well, I mean, I tried thinking about this a little bit in the sense that, okay, well, obviously both under the Frankfurt model, both acts would be compulsive behavior.
Yes.
It would be so, but there is clearly a difference.
Yes.
Between it, that the Frankfurt model doesn't capture. So
I buy both of those, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it seems that while they're both compulsive behavior, one, it strikes intuitively that one should be held morally responsible
for weak-willed actions. Yes.
And that it really does reflect one's character.
You can have a weak character or not. Yeah.
Yes.
Think about, this is what discipline is, essentially, right? It's the ability to ignore first order desires.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So
I can imagine a harder, more hardcore Frankfurt fan biting the bullet there. What do you think of that response? And just saying, okay, then, well, if you've stipulated that the person can't resist the desire, even if they should be able to, well, then, yeah, they're not morally responsible.
Yeah, but then you'd have to respond and say that behavior still reflects who they are, though. So if the idea is that, you're free in the Frankfurt model, if behavior aligns with second order volitions.
Mm-hmm.
So, but in your morally responsible when behavior or when first order desires align with second order volitions and that behavior becomes actionable.
Yeah.
And that's because it's a reflection of kind of higher order desires.
The type of person you want to be. It's almost reflective of what's happening at the third level.
Yes. So when you kind of peel back and ask, like, okay, what is this framework? Like you just said, it's a reflection of ultimately, who are you? Okay, well, that framework doesn't capture this scenario, which actually does reflect who you are. You're a weak-willed person.
Yes.
So, and it doesn't capture that. So it's like, okay, all right.
Could Frankfurt push back and say, no, it does capture that. It can capture that distinction. Well, no, but I get what Frankfurt's saying about, or Fischer is saying about how it can't really actually, because you want to preserve that distinction, but you can't do it with the tools that Frankfurt laid out, at least in his 71 paper. He might have kind of gone on to do that, but because then he's almost making this sort of, there's almost this like weird essentialist claim kind of going on in the background that like some desires are really irresistible and some aren't. And that's on the one hand, but then if anytime that you don't have mesh between the first order and the second order desires, it's not free action. Those seem to be in contest with each other, right?
And it almost seems like special pleading points too. Like when some behavior is just like irresistible, other behavior is, like it seems like you can point to
the cake's supposed to be irresistible, but the heroin's not. You know what I mean? It's
yeah. So
But which is not to deny that there is a difference between cake and heroin. Do you know what I mean? Like I could eat a lot of
Sure.
cake and then still resist any given piece, and I probably couldn't do that with heroin, right? Um, but I take Fischer's remark to be right on. But Frankfurt can't give you that account, you know?
And I think actually this bleeds well into the
Wait, can I actually linger for a second on this? I wanted to
yeah,
ask you.
yeah.
Okay, here's I don't have any like developed thoughts about this, but I find the way that Frankfurt lays out a lot of his thesis, everything besides that point is extremely intuitive, and I like it. Can Fisher's reasons responsiveness absorb everything there? Like if you just translate, I guess if you translate desires into reasons, um, it probably can then, right?
Well, that's what I was thinking. Like, and like,
Yeah,
like almost like another view of it, but
yeah.
reasons instead of desires. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but
Because I
I
don't know.
I think his approach definitely captures weak-willed people. Like,
Yeah.
but which scenarios are you thinking that Fisher might not capture?
I don't know. Let me there was something that I had highlighted and I'm forgetting what section. Oh, it was in the section 2.4. So he says, this is entitled Why Hierarchy. Um so what he actually levies a critique from Watson against Frankfurt. So quoting from Watson, he says Frankfurt's picture of practical judgment seems to be that of an agent with a given set of first order desires concerning which he then forms second order volitions. But this picture seems to be distorted. As I see it, agents frequently formulate values concerning alternatives they had not hitherto desired. Initially, they do not or need not usually ask themselves which of their desires they want to be effective in action. They ask themselves which course of action is most worth pursuing. So, and then on the next page, very top of 133, this is Fischer now. So the problem is not that Frankfurt's picture presupposes that agents have fixed sets of first order desires, but there is definitely a problem. The model appears to present us as deliberating in the first instance about ourselves, our own mental states, first order desires. But this does not seem to be an accurate portrayal of practical reasoning, at least in most cases. Typically, we are focused on courses of action, and our deliberations are more accurately conceptualized as about, in a direct sense, these courses of action in the world. Okay, it seems to me, so I agree with the frequency point that he's making there. Like, actually, most of the time, we just kind of deliberate about courses of action, not which desires we want to partake in or not. That seems psychologically accurate of me, right? Like a lot of reasoning is just this kind of very practical, how to get things done and how to go about doing things. But but at the same time, psychologically, I do deliberate about sort of what desires I want to indulge or not. Um, and so because he says, typically we're focused on this, but can I just don't know. So how can Fisher's account encapsulate kind of the purest form of what Frankfurt's talking about? So when I really do kind of have, we talked about it previously as there's a lot of these first order desires kind of activating at different times. Impulses strike you, right? Could have cake, could do whatever. Um, and sometimes you indulge them and sometimes you don't. And those are based on your second order volitions. That seems to be, I'm saying that's true. I know that to be true. Now, does this fit within Fisher's account seamlessly or not? So he would phrase that because I take it that because this is I mean, he's saying like a hierarchy of wills it's not required, like it's not necessary to explain all this.
He's kind of throwing it out. Like, it doesn't really fit into Fisher's view, because he's saying like the hierarchy itself is sort of a
it's
Kind
a
of
needless
artificial
Yeah,
construction in a sense. Yeah.
he specifically says like the benefit of his model is that it doesn't require, the hassle of the hierarchy.
I just thought that they're
Part of the problem for me is like I kind of enjoyed like the framework of like the hierarchical approach, like just kind of analyzing one's own thoughts. I just don't know if it's strictly like necessary.
well, it seems to me that so here's where it might be necessary. If a reasons responsive account cannot account for when I do in fact deliberate about my own desires, because I'm saying that that's psychologically true, and then I'm kind of seeing which view can accommodate that, because Frankfurt's clearly can, right? But I'm not saying that therefore Frankfurt's view is right. I'm saying,
Is there any case where like the Frankfurt can capture it, but
Fischer's can't?
Yeah, right.
And then the question would be, how would Fischer's view need to be modified in order to capture that?
Right.
And that's not something that I can kind of come up with off the top of my head, but it's more of raising that question to kind of think about further.
It's a really good question to raise.
I don't know. I just don't know. I don't know how reasons responsiveness can kind of, I guess so, because to be honest, the way that I would conceptualize it almost puts a hierarchical view into the reasons responsive account. So the way that I might, if I had to think about it in a reasons responsive framework, I might kind of say, in a very Frankfurtian way, desires and impulses kind of just, activate at certain times and not, right? We're pulled by wants in a way that we're not pulled by reasons. Right. So, but then the problem is I can't help but conceptualize it as the next level of that is our rational deliberation about which of those we want to indulge.
Yeah, it's almost like Fischer has embedded in his kind of non-hierarchical model the idea that we use hierarchies in our reasoning. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, I wasn't saying that Fischer's doing that, but I'm saying, might he have to?
Right.
Yeah. Because otherwise,
to be consistent.
Yeah, I don't know how, because I don't really view, because I don't view hierarchical wills really as an issue, because they don't seem to be that conceptually extravagant. Like I'm not making a metaphysical claim that I have some sort of real like tiered. I'm just saying intrapsychically, it doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't seem gratuitous to me. Do you? I mean, I know simplicity is always a nice thing to have in theories and accounts, but it doesn't seem extremely gratuitous to have a hierarchical.
I'm actually having a hard time imagining someone who's reason responsive, but just doesn't can't use any hierarchy.
Because just to grant one reason over another.
That is the hierarchy. Yeah. That is, I mean, you can imagine. Maybe it doesn't get to like a certain tier.
No, he would say that that's not a hierarchy of will. That's just valuing some reasons more than others. I think. Right. I think that's what Fischer would say. But I don't know. I guess I am kind of okay with more than that. I am kind of wondering if, I don't know. Maybe I should just raise the wondering and move on. But I don't know. Is my question pulling you at all, Adam?
I think so. I'm just trying to think a little bit of just like because I do capture different things. I'm not convinced that Frankfurt's model captures everything perfectly, obviously.
Oh no, yeah.
Based on what we just read here, but I do think there is something missing in Fischer's model, not in the sense that there is like any example I can point to right now, but more so that I still think there is something to, desires and behavior aligning with desires that you want to become actionable.
Everything we talked about in the Frankfurt episode has to be absorbed if I'm to buy this view, because those are just psychologically true, those deliberations.
Yes, I still think so.
Yes. Yes.
It's
Yeah.
it's not going to describe perfectly when more responsibility obtains.
We've got to nail this down. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's still I think a valuable lens to view when it obtains. So,
I think maybe we should just raise that ponderance and then move on, because
it almost seems to like work asymmetrically in the sense where it's like, okay, if behavior is from the cause of a first order desire and it aligns with a second order volition, you definitely are morally responsible. You know what I mean? Like in that case, you're definitely morally responsible.
Yes.
And still under Fischer's view too. Comes when behavior and
deviates,
desires that don't align. The question is, are you not morally responsible? And the answer is not necessarily. You know what I mean? Like you could still be morally responsible.
You know, I thought, I was thinking about this too, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Fischer actually doesn't mention this, but I thought that, remember this was a remark in the Frankfurt paper that when there is alignment, this goes to addressing it's both with a hierarchical, but the regress problem that he raises, because I thought that the regress problem was actually quite a nice one that Frankfurt preemptively solved.
Right? I totally agree. I just missed this one.
because when I thought that he gave a nice account of like, look, when your first and second and third order desires align decisively, that just cuts off the chain. This is the type of person you want to be. That entails wanting to indulge certain type of desires, and you have those desires, and then it just terminates I forget the language that Frankfurt uses in his paper, but he says it, kind of decisively cuts it off there. And we need not, kind of go into it further. Right now, that's a good account of the positive when they do align. And then, obviously Fischer's critiques are more centered on when they don't, I think. But the regress problem doesn't seem to be a damning one, in my opinion.
No, I didn't think so either. I do want to kind of pause on like the end of paragraph 1 in the regress problem.
Oh, okay.
What if there is a conflict at the second level, or what if the individual does not care, is a wanton at the third level?
Yeah.
Well, I just want to pause there and just kind of ruminate about that a little bit. So
I thought about this too. I had it highlighted. Yeah.
Yeah. Now this was an interesting point, one way or the other. So what does that mean to be wanton at the third level? That would mean that you don't really have any desire to distinguish between second order desires one way or the other. So that's what that would mean there.
You don't care about, and remember we had come up with the conceptualization as the type of person you want to be, right? Yes. The wanton with respect to the second level wouldn't care what type of person they want to be. Here's a real example for me, actually. I have multiple clusters of first order desires, things that roughly kind of coincide with each other, right? There's a lot of ones in philosophy, for example. I like ambitious academically, pursue these things, actually develop like my own views on these, allow it to enrich my life in that sense, right? And I endorse those. Like I'm happy to have those desires, and I'm happy for them to be active, right? I also have clusters of desires in other areas of my life. Let's use like physical fitness or physical health or something, right? I have desires to eat well, to work out, and I endorse those desires, right? And I'm happy to have them activated. There are practical scenarios in which both of those things can't happen at the same time. There are times where I have to just postpone, like I can't have the perfect meal because I've got to read this paper and get to my next class or something, right? So that's where the third order, the type of person I want to be, identifies decisively with one set of second order desires and cuts them off, right? So if I didn't care what type of person I wanted to be, then it would just be like, kind of whatever, I guess. It would just be, I would just do whatever I was doing. Like if I was going to the gym already, like I just, I'd keep going to the gym, I guess. And if it was right.
Yeah. And I actually don't see a problem with being at a certain level, and I mean, as you just laid out, you might want to go to the gym. You might want to read. And, maybe at that level, there'd still be some distinguishing factor on the third level where you want one of those second order.
You want to be one type of person more.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But once you reach a certain level, I kind of was just thinking about it, was kind of conceptualizing, maybe you do reach a point where two versions of yourself become indistinguishable. You know what I mean? Like,
so like you're a wanton at like the 7th level or something, you mean?
Possibly.
Whatever that would mean. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And does that matter? Like
you're basically, to be honest, I think you were almost edging into like a causa sui point. Do you know what I mean? It's like you don't actually create kind of who you end up being in some sense, right? Because like you can't own Frankfurt all the way up. You know, like there's a veil of ignorance kind of with respect to the orders at some level.
Sure. I mean, I bet
that doesn't seem to be an issue because that's just it wouldn't even make sense that this is almost like Galen's point about like it's incoherent to say like you made yourself. Who's the you at that point then? Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I just kind of like imagined, if I were to draw this out and I would reach a certain point where I actually really couldn't distinguish between between two different hierarchies that I'm now on the 7th level. And it's like, do I really feel strongly one way or the other? Like, do I want, exactly. Be this kind of like path and, or like this hierarchy over another. And it's like, I don't know. These are both I would value. I would distinguish over possibly infinite other hierarchies.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I don't necessarily.
I'm actually writing this. I'm actually writing this out right now. So I want to talk through it for a second with you guys. Okay. So here's 2 examples of first order desires. I want to exercise and I want to read. Right. At the second order level, I could endorse the you want to do those things, right? So
you want to have those desires.
Exactly. Yeah, you're okay with them being activated. Now that cashes out at the third level of the type of person you want to be. So in the first one, it's kind of attributes about yourself, something like I want to be like a fit person, right? Or I want to be an erudite person in the second one. At the fourth level, you could even imagine it works better with a different example. Instead of exercise, because that I accidentally chose 2 things that were both very rational all the way up the line, right?
Yeah.
let me choose. So instead of exercising, let's say that it was going out and partying, right? So you could want that because socialize, hang out with friends you haven't seen in a while, it's a good time, right? And that type of person at the third order level is a fun person. They're a good hangout. They're entertaining. They probably have a lot of friends. Now at the fourth level, this is interesting because then I wonder if the fourth level is the highest you can go, because this is almost the meta type of person you want to be. So this is almost like the big 5 personality traits. Almost. This is like, do I want to be in the partying case a spontaneous person, right? Do I want to be sort of a like live in the moment person, a carpe diem person? Or in the reading case, do I want to be a reserved person, like a very disciplined, kind of structured, orderly person, right? I don't think you can get past that level. And that's where you kind of, is that where the veil, of ignorance is at?
I feel like you could go higher.
I've got it already. The fifth level could be, do I want to be the type of person who can like have that level of control over myself? You know what I mean? Like actually just embody kind of the extroverted, fun, like loving life, or embody that. But at that point,
Yeah, I mean, it just devolves into
you
very
get closer into the darkness. Yeah.
yeah, it's like, do I want to be this kind of person? Do I want to be this kind of person? That
Yeah.
now that's an interesting question. Do I want to be that kind of person? I feel like you reach a certain
Yeah.
level where being wanton is I don't
It's inescapable.
yeah, it is. And I don't see it as a problem.
No, because for wantonness to not be a problem at any level, you'd have to be endorsing Kazusui, which then, right? Because and then Galen
Feels
would
like
say, I think you would, because then Galen would step in and say that's incoherent.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I don't think that's what like the framework's there to capture. Like the framework's there to capture
Yeah.
like, you know, discernible desires that can be distinguished and made actionable, and it's not meant to be, the framework's not there to like, you know,
Yeah.
us out of the void, it's like out of the abyss, it just
Yeah.
single-handedly. So
Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally agree. Um, we've been going for like a good 2 hours at this point. Were there any
it has to be the last one. That's the last one. That's the biggest takedown of Frankfurt.
the wholehearted, yeah. Okay, so
Yeah.
this is section 2.6.
Yeah.
Okay. If you want, I've got some highlights that might introduce the issue.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. This is quoting Fischer. On Frankfurt's early view, an individual identifies with a first order desire and the relevant course of action in virtue of forming a second order volition to act in accordance with it. The problem comes from a combination of invoking identification as part of the analysis of acting freely and giving a hierarchical account of identification. When an agent identifies with a particular first order desire, he selects it as representing his real self, or perhaps the real self, for the purpose of practical reasoning or some such thing. The idea is that identification points to the real, basic, or genuine self, at least for the purpose of, or in the domain of practical reasoning. In our locution, we might say, or the self that that person wants to be, right? Continuing in the next paragraph, the problem is that the hierarchical account does not have the resources to distinguish between an individual's real self or real self for the purposes of practical reasoning and the individual's ego ideal, that is, what he wants to be or perhaps aspires to be. So getting into our fourth or fifth level. Lamentably, there can be a difference between who one really is, and who one wants even desperately to be. And the hierarchical apparatus, in Frankfurt's case, the second order volitions, appears to be incapable of distinguishing between the real self and the ego ideal, who one is and who one wants to be. And if I'm understanding that point, he's saying at a certain point, you can't get out of this, because who you are is going to be who you want to be. But then there could be there almost seems to be this like super self who's like, oh no, but I really want to be this, but that's just you then, right?
you.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the idea is like the second order volition is like pretty much behavior you endorse.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I don't endorse this behavior, so that's not me. I didn't act freely.
Mm-hmm.
Like in a way, like that is you. You know what I mean? Like
you did do that. Yeah.
Yeah, you did do that. And and once again, Frankfurt's model, I think, is really good at distinguishing between, there is behavior that one does endorse versus behavior one doesn't endorse. And that distinction is really important. But the idea that it's not you, no, it is you. That is who you are, but it's not who you want to be. And it's not behavior you endorse, but it is who you are. That does form the picture of like,
you know what? This almost seems like he's almost just making the point of you don't have access to that rational third party within yourself, almost like that. That could almost be like a phrasing of what he's getting at here, right? It's like at a certain point, it's just like, it's almost the same point we were making. Like at some point, you are who you are, and like you don't have access to this like who you want to be, because that is just who you are at a certain level. Yeah.
Yes. And so, it's like back to the cake example. I don't know if this will be any good, but it's like, okay, I want to eat the cake, or I don't want to eat the cake, but I ate the cake, and that behavior is not in alignment with my second order volition. But at the end of the day, I did eat the cake. So whether, that it could be my real self that I'm pointing to here, or it could just be my ego ideal. It could be that I want to be the kind of person that passes on the cake.
Yeah.
And that's who I identify with. But in reality, I ate the cake, and that is my real self here. So, and distinguishing between those two is hard, because it's like, okay, maybe my real self is the kind of person who wouldn't eat the cake unless I eat the cake compulsively. But who's to say? Right?
You're just hand waving that's you. You're saying, please believe me.
Yes, exactly. It's so who's to say one way or the other, whether it's your real self, not forcing this behavior, or an ego ideal not forcing this behavior.
Yes.
So I thought that was a big takedown.
And it's damning enough at these lower levels, the discordance in the first and second order, but it gets kind of harder to resist as you go up. Right? Because it's like, oh, I want to be the type of person who has that discipline, right? Okay. But then in the scenarios where you don't like that, but that is who you are. Like, you are a weak-willed person, or something like that. So as it seems even more damning the higher up the ladder you go, even though it is damning at the lower ones too.
Sure.
Yeah. I take it that, I wonder how Frankfurt would respond to that, because the point is that he's having his kind of real self cake and eating it too, right? And it'd be interesting. I don't know. Did he ever? He doesn't reference. Does he? If Frankfurt responds to this, I don't think he does. Oh, I'm curious if
He said at one point that just with regard to these critiques, Frankfurt had later writing that.
I don't know what those are. And I don't know if that refers to this point in particular or not.
Yeah,
I don't know. I knew I was like, oh, Adam's gonna just like be just gutted by these sections.
Well, here's the thing. It's like, I think it was really good to see a takedown of Frankfurt's work, in the sense that, it's always
temper
fun.
That fandom.
It's it's always fun to read a takedown, because it just keeps you honest.
Yes.
But also, number two would be, an interesting thing to take away from this conversation is I will give some serious thought to potential moral situations that Frankfurt would capture
that Fischer wouldn't. Yes,
exactly. Because there's such value in the framing still of Frankfurt.
I know, and that's my biggest ponderance that I need to dwell on is. It was just a rephrasing of your question. Are there things that Frankfurt captures that Fischer can't? And if so, how could his view be revised such to include those?
Yeah.
That is the follow-up question for this episode.
Yeah,
I know Michael McKenna from the University of Arizona falls into he has semi-compatibilist leanings. He's written reason responsiveness papers, and I think he has some slight differences with Dana Nelken at UC San Diego, who is a reasons responsive compatibilist, I believe. So we'll have to look at some papers by both of them and see if we can get some more stuff on reasons responsiveness, because I want to think these through. Yeah.
Of course.
Yes. This was a great, this was a classic episode in, let's unpack this view. It was a classic unpacking episode.
Yes.
Is a classic unpacking episode.
The only regret is they couldn't go longer because there was more stuff, but I'm
gonna table. I have questions about determinism that will come up, I think, even maybe more clearly in more reasons responsiveness. I have them in a separate document, so that'll be a tease for the next episode, because I think that there are very interesting questions about how relevant determinism can be for mechanism ownership. Okay, so maybe with that kind of prelude for next episode, it may not be reasons responsive. We'll just have to see about paper lengths and such like that, practical concerns. But we will be diving back into reasons responsiveness at some point. So with that, I hope that listeners enjoy this long episode. And if you haven't yet, read this paper. It's very worth it. And if you haven't listened to my conversation with John Martin Fischer. So until next time, thanks for listening.